So now that we've had an overview of three major totalitarian dictators, let's think about how how World War II ultimately breaks out. Now, first off, it's important for us to realize that the attempts to establish peace after World War I effectively failed, right? And because the people who agreed to the Treaty of Versailles were unable to actually establish a lasting sense of collective security and peace, we'll see that this opens up an opportunity first for Germany to continue to militarize and I guess threaten the sense of security in Europe. And there's very little ability for these other countries ultimately to try to check this German militaristic expansion in the 1930s. So one thing we know is the 1919 Treaty of Versailles was not able to create an enduring peace. And one of the major reasons why this is, arguably, was Article 231, right? The war guilt clause. The fact that this article punished Germany so severely was the reason why so many Germans resented the Treaty of Versailles, argued the stab in the back theory, right, or Diktat, which means dictated peace, right? This is one of the reasons why someone like Hitler was able to come to power, because they were so resentful of the sense of punishment that they received from the Treaty of Versailles. You also saw that the League of Nations really didn't have the will to maintain peace. The League of Nations did not have the U.S. or the USSR as members, and it wasn't particularly strong in terms of maintaining peace. What you're going to see is that in the 1930s, countries like Germany and Italy are going to become increasingly aggressive. Italy is going to invade Ethiopia, and the League of Nations is just going to sort of stand by and watch. Germany is going to become increasingly expansionist and take measures to violate the Versailles Treaty, and the League of Nations really doesn't do much to stop this. So you see the League of Nations, even though its goal was to promote a lasting peace in Europe, really didn't have the measures to actually do so, particularly when aggressive states started to emerge. You also saw any sort of written agreement, paper agreements of the 1920s were not really able to be successfully enforced. The Locarno Pact of 1925, which we know was an agreement to settle disputes between Germany and European nations peacefully. In particular, they were thinking about the border regions along, I guess, Germany's western border. But again, this kind of gave the Europeans a false sense of security about their future. The so-called spirit of Locarno that resulted from the Locarno Pact no longer persisted when Hitler took power, right? There was no longer kind of a peaceful and amicable sentiment between Germany and other countries when Hitler rose to power with his aggressive nationalistic policies. Also, you just found that the provisions of the spirit of Locarno were not enforceable, particularly after Hitler maintained power, or Hitler established power. Then there's the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which we know was this treaty that actually said that war was illegal, right? It was signed by 62 nations, right? So, you know, in theory, it could have, I mean, the fact that it was signed by so many countries is significant, but again, how can you actually make war illegal when one country decides to be an aggressor? Really, the only way that you can respond to that is by two going to war. So really, the Kellogg-Briand Pact lacks the ability to be enforced. And Hitler actually argued that a lot of his military ventures actually were for defensive purposes. Remember, again, Hitler is operating under the pretense that the Treaty of Versailles punished Germany, so they were trying to sort of act in retaliation. So what sort of answer did the League of Nations actually have to Hitler's arguably defensive measures, right? Then you have Hitler withdraw from the League of Nations in 1933, and right after he withdraws, he starts to secretly rearm Germany. Now, other countries like Italy, Britain, and France realize the potential of this danger, right? And they protest Hitler's withdrawal from the League of Nations very strongly. However, they actually don't really do much to stop Germany from rearming, right? They say that they will use force to maintain the political status quo in Europe, but eventually what we're going to see in particular is Britain developing a policy called appeasement, to try to avoid going to war. And what appeasement in a lot of ways does is it actually allowed Germany to expand in power. But I mean, what England was interested in doing was not going to war, but essentially when they finally did go to war with Germany, they found themselves facing a more powerful Germany because of the way appeasement let Germany continue to expand. You're also going to see that a year after Hitler withdraws from the League of Nations, he's going to ally with Italy to assist the fascists in winning the Spanish Civil War. So again, you start to see right after Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933, same year, Germany emerge as a threat to the security of future European peace, right? You're also going to see imperialist actions start to precede the war. Italy is going to invade Ethiopia in 1935. In a lot of ways, this is revenge for, in 1896, you actually had Ethiopians defeat Italians when they were attempting to colonize. So this was sort of Italy's retaliation for that embarrassment that they suffered there. And the League of Nations attempted to stop this. They did impose sanctions on Italy, but these sanctions were very weak. Part of this was because they still wanted Italy to support them in opposing Hitler. At this point, still Italy and Germany were not yet allied to help the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. So the idea behind these countries in the League of Nations was to, kind of keep Italy on their good side by not being too harsh on them for invading Ethiopia. But effectively, this means that the sanction is not at all a deterrent for Italy invading Ethiopia, and actually the sanctions are going to be lifted in 1936. And what this shows, actually, to Hitler is that the UN really isn't strong enough to try to enforce peace, right? So even though this was an action that was taken to try to restrain Italy, Hitler is observing this as kind of a further indication that the League of Nations is too weak, and he sort of sees this as a reason to continue to militarize and to continue to try to strengthen Germany. Also, you're going to see that Japan is playing into this this expanding of imperialism, right? Japan actually started invading Manchuria in 1931, and it eventually will join an alliance with Italy and Germany, the Rome-Berlin axis. And what you're going to see is just like the way the League of Nations responds to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, the League of Nations kind of stands by as Japan invades China. So especially the rape of Nanking, as it is called, the League of Nations does little to nothing to actually stop this. I already mentioned the Spanish Civil War, but just again as a brief recap, Mussolini and Hitler joined forces together. Their goal is to promote a fascist victory. Francisco Franco ends up being victorious and overthrowing the Republican government in Spain. So what we're going to see here is that the League of Nations does very little to stop the spread of fascism in Spain, right? Part of this is because Britain and France were actually split on the question about what to do during the Spanish Civil War, and the USSR is actually the only country that aids the loyalists against the fascist government in Spain. So ultimately, just having the USSR help the loyalists was not enough, and this results in a fascist victory in the Spanish Civil War. Also, because Italy and Berlin effectively joined together in the Spanish Civil War, this is going to result in the Rome-Berlin axis, right? So an alliance between Italy and Germany, and eventually Japan, who had already invaded Manchuria at this point, is also going to join along with this alliance. The other thing that's going to happen that's going to contribute to the tension leading up to the Second World War is that Germany is going to start to remilitarize the Rhineland. As you might remember, the Treaty of Versailles demilitarized the Rhineland, but now Germany is violating the Treaty of Versailles and starting to build up military force there again. So again, this is directly violating the Versailles Treaty as well as the Locarno Pact. Basically, what you're going to see is that as Germany remilitarizes the Rhineland, this means that German and French forces can actually be directly across the border from one another, right? Basically, there can be German soldiers immediately on the French border, very much threatening France's security. One of the reasons why Hitler decides to remilitarize the Rhineland is because Hitler watched as the League of Nations did little to stop the invasion of Ethiopia by the Italians. Also, Hitler watched as the League of Nations did very little to stop the Japanese in Manchuria. And so Hitler basically was convinced at this point that France and Britain would do nothing to stop Germany from remilitarizing the Rhineland. France basically was unwilling to enforce the Treaty of Versailles, stopping the remilitarization of the Rhineland without actually getting help from Britain. And so actually historians argue that if France was willing to try to stop the Germans on its own, it could have averted Germany's expansion at this point, because the French at that point were still stronger than Germany. But again, France was not willing to actually help out without Britain's help, and so because the League of Nations did little to nothing to stop the remilitarization, this shows us that Germany is again able to expand and gain power. Also realize that Britain still has this sense of pacifism that remains from World War I. They very much are not interested in going to another war. So they don't want to sort of risk a world war with Germany, right? Actually, some British, remember, they didn't really feel like the Treaty of Versailles was fair to the Germans either, so you still had that sentiment. And so because Britain and France were sort of unable to actually effectively stop Germany from remilitarizing the Rhineland, you have Germany now very, very close to the Franco-German border with troops posing a major threat to France's security. So very, very close to the war now. We have Germany starting to actually expand its borders without actually firing any shots, right? The first instance of German conquest was called Anschluss. It took place in March 1938, and this is when Germany annexed Austria. And so actually what happens here is that the Germans actually just threaten to take military action against Austria. Their threat of military action actually forces the chancellor to resign, and then the Nazi Party assumes control in Austria. So actually, it was literally only the threat of going to war with Austria that causes Austria to fold and the Nazis effectively take over. So this is significant because Anschluss signifies Germany actually taking over Austria without resorting to any violence or military action, right? Does not fire a single shot and they absorb Austria. Now, this is an opportunity for members of the League of Nations to respond. The Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, had the opportunity to join an alliance with France and Russia at this point to sort of counter Germany's actions, but Chamberlain rejected joining this alliance. He believed that by allying with France and Russia, that would appear to be too aggressive diplomatically, and it might destroy attempts to establish or negotiate peace with Hitler in the future. So because Neville Chamberlain did not want to appear aggressive by allying with France and Russia, again, this is an example of the international community doing basically nothing to respond to Hitler's aggression.